"Sir, I'm sorry, but the flight is overbooked," the gate agent said, her voice clipped but polite as she tapped furiously on her keyboard. Julian Tate stared at her, annoyed but composed. "I paid for first class. I don't do standby." He wasn't being arrogant, he just wasn't used to hearing the word no, not when he was the one funding half the startups in Silicon Valley. Not when his name was on the private equity firm that could buy out this entire airline if he wanted to. But this was supposed to be an easy, quiet commercial flight. Just one night in Chicago for a board meeting, then back to New York. "Give me a second," the agent said, glancing nervously at her screen. "There might be one economy seat left, last row," he blinked. "Economy," she flinched. "It's that or wait for the next one, which is in 6 hours. Julian exhaled and ran a hand through his dark hair. His private jet was grounded for maintenance, and this was supposed to be easy. "Fine, last row. Just get me on that plane." 5 minutes later, he ducked through the narrow aisle, annoyed, tall frame barely making it past the exit signs. Of course the seat was tiny. Of course it didn't recline. And of course someone was in it. A woman curled by the window, hugging a denim jacket and looking like she hadn't slept in days. "Hi," he said, trying to sound civil despite the storm brewing in his chest. "I think you're in my seat." She looked up. Her eyes were bright hazel, tired but kind. "Oh, She glanced at her boarding pass. 29B, yeah, that's me." He held up his ticket. "Same, overbooked. They switched me." She tugged her bag closer to her. "Look, I really need the window. I've got flight anxiety and I'll pay you to switch, please." Julian raised an eyebrow. "You want to pay me?" "I know it sounds crazy, but I haven't seen my sister in 2 years and I'm already panicking, and if I don't have the window to focus on, I might lose it." He looked at her again. The girl was clearly stressed, her hands trembling just slightly. Something about her made him pause. She wasn't trying to be difficult, she was just desperate. "You don't have to pay me," he said finally. "Keep the seat." She blinked. "Seriously?" He dropped into the middle seat beside her. "I'm not a monster." She gave a soft, relieved laugh, and for the first time he noticed the corner of her mouth lift into a smile. "I'm Juliet Zander," she said. "Thank you, Julian," he replied. "Tate." She nodded like the name didn't mean anything to her. That was refreshing. As the plane rumbled down the runway, Juliet's grip tightened on her seat. Her eyes stayed glued to the window. "You okay?" he asked. "No," she said honestly, "but I'm trying not to cry, so maybe don't talk for a minute." He respected that. But halfway through the flight, when turbulence hit and she gripped the armrest like it was a lifeline, he gently touched her hand. "Hey," he said quietly, "just breathe, you're not alone on this ride." She looked at him with glassy eyes and something inside him cracked. They spent the next 2 hours talking, really talking, about everything except work. Juliet told him about her job as a freelance illustrator, how she lived in a tiny apartment in Denver and barely scraped by. She had 3 siblings, a cat named Pancake, and a love of old vinyl records. He didn't mention his wealth, or his firm, or that he owned a pied-à-terre in Paris and a brownstone in Manhattan. Instead, he asked about her art, genuinely curious. She showed him sketches on her iPad, stunning portraits, dreamy cityscapes, a style that felt both whimsical and raw. "You're insanely talented," he said, meaning it. She flushed. "You're just being nice." "I'm not nice," he said. "Ask anyone." She laughed. "Well, you gave up your seat. That counts for something." The flight landed too soon. As they shuffled off, she turned to him. "Thank you again." "For everything," he hesitated. "You said you're staying with your sister." "Yeah, just for the weekend, then back to Denver." He didn't want to say goodbye. Something about her made the air feel different, lighter, real. "Look," he said, "I know we just met, and this is probably wildly inappropriate, but can I take you to dinner while you're here?" Juliet blinked. "Dinner?" "Yeah, I know a place. It's not far. Best steak in Chicago." She studied him for a long moment. "You don't even know me." "I know enough to want to." She bit her lip, then nodded. "Okay, but only if I get to pick dessert. Deal." That night, he picked her up in a sleek black car with a driver, and she raised an eyebrow. "Okay, mystery man." "That's not a normal Uber." "I like nice things," he said simply. They ate at a rooftop restaurant with chandeliers and skyline views. She wore a simple green blouse and jeans. He couldn't take his eyes off her. "Over wine and laughter?" she asked. So what do you actually do? He hesitated. Then I run a firm, we invest in companies. She narrowed her eyes. Like Shark Tank, he grinned. Kind of less drama, more spreadsheets. She tilted her head. Wait, Tate Capital? Yeah, her jaw dropped. That's you, you're that Julian Tate. Guilty. She stared at him. You're a millionaire. Technically, she leaned back in her chair. Wow, still want dessert, she laughed. Only if you're not going to buy the whole bakery. No promises. They shared tiramisu and wandered through the city after. He didn't touch her, didn't push. But as they stood by the river, lights shimmering on the water, she looked up at him. This wasn't how I thought today would go. Me neither, he said, but I'm glad it did. Her hand brushed his and he took it gently. Julian, she said, voice quiet, I don't normally do this. Neither do I, he kissed her. Soft, unhurried, she tasted like espresso and something sweet. His heart thudded, foreign and loud in his chest. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his. God, she whispered. What are we doing? He smiled. I think we're starting something. Juliet stood in front of the antique mirror framed in peeling gold, her fingers hesitating at her collarbone. She wasn't sure what made her more nervous, the fact that she was meeting Julian again tonight, or the fact that she couldn't stop thinking about the way his hand had felt in hers by the river. Why am I acting like this? She muttered to the mirror, brushing a stray hair behind her ear. She never let herself get carried away, especially not with someone who had a driver and dined on rooftops like it was normal. Her sister, Leela, leaned against the bedroom doorframe, arms crossed over her oversized t-shirt. That's the third time you've changed. Juliet let out a breath. Do I look like I'm trying too hard? You look like someone who's trying not to fall headfirst into something big, Leila said, stepping into the room. But Jules, maybe that's okay. Juliet frowned. He's a lot. He's a man who gave up his seat for you on a flight and didn't make it weird. That's rare enough. Go see where it leads. Juliet didn't answer, but her heart beat a little faster as she reached for her shoes. When she stepped outside, Julian was already waiting by the curb, leaning casually against the side of a navy sedan with a matte finish and tinted windows. The driver stayed seated, engine purring softly. You look like you belong in an art gallery, he said, his eyes scanning hers, not her clothes. That better not be your opening line for every woman you pick up, she replied, closing the door behind her. He grinned. Only the ones who sketch New York skylines from memory. She rolled her eyes and slid into the car. They drove without speaking for a while, the city lights flickering past as twilight deepened. Eventually, she glanced at him. So where are we going? There's a jazz club I like, he said. Not flashy, you'll like it, she raised an eyebrow. Jazz? I figured you for a classical piano and rare wine kind of guy. I'm full of surprises. The club was tucked beneath an old building on a quiet street. The entrance was marked only by a brass lantern and a velvet rope. Inside, the space opened into a warm, amber-lit room with worn leather booths and a small stage where a trio played a slow, smoky tune. They settled into a booth near the back, the music weaving between them like a whisper. Juliet scanned the room. Okay, this place is incredible. How have I never heard of it? You wouldn't unless someone brought you, he said, leaning back. They don't advertise. She studied him beneath the soft light. You don't strike me as someone who hides in corners. I hide in plain sight, he replied. It's easier than people think. She tilted her head. Why would someone like you need to hide? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked toward the stage where the saxophonist closed her eyes and let the notes pour out of her like a confession. I've been around a lot of people who wanted something from me, he said finally. Money, mostly. Access, influence. It's hard to tell who's real when everything you own is a bargaining chip. She didn't speak, watching him with a new kind of stillness. You're not what I expected, she said softly. Neither are you. The server came by, dropping off 2 glasses of bourbon that Julian hadn't ordered but clearly had arranged in advance. Juliet took a sip, the warmth spreading slowly. Are you always this prepared? Only when I'm not willing to leave things to chance. She set her glass down. I can't tell if that's romantic or terrifying. Both, probably. They listened to the music for a while, and when the singer began a low, aching version of At Last, Juliet rested her chin on her hand. You know, she said, I used to think I'd end up with someone simple. A guy who worked 9 to 5, maybe coached Little League on weekends and made bad pancakes. Julian looked amused. And now you're here with a guy who signs merger deals from hotel rooftops and probably doesn't know how to make toast. I didn't say I was complaining. He leaned closer, his voice low. Good. Because I've been thinking about you since the plane landed. Juliet's breath caught, but she refused to look away. Do you always move this fast? No, he said. But I've learned that when something feels right, waiting doesn't make it more real. It just makes it easier to lose. She stared at him, her heart thudding harder than it should have. The band launched into a livelier tune, and Julian stood, holding out a hand. Dance with me, she hesitated. There's no one else on the floor. Then we'll be the first. She took his hand. He led her onto the small dance floor, his palm settling gently at her waist. She moved cautiously at first, but he guided her with quiet confidence, his rhythm smooth, unhurried. Juliet glanced up at him. You've done this before, once or twice. Mostly at weddings I didn't want to attend. She laughed softly, letting herself get pulled into the sway of it, the way his presence steadied her. After the song ended, they didn't go back to the booth. They stayed standing, holding each other as the next tune began. Julian leaned down, his breath warm at her ear. What would happen if you didn't get on that return flight? She froze. What are you saying? I'm saying I don't want this to be a weekend memory. I want more. She pulled back slightly, searching his face. Are you serious? I never say things I don't mean. She stepped away, her voice quiet. You don't know me. I want to. Juliet's eyes darted toward the door, her chest tightened. I need to think, she said. He didn't follow her as she walked out into the night. He didn't call her name or chase her down the street, but the look in his eyes stayed with her long after she disappeared into the dark. Julian hadn't moved from the booth since she left. The band was on their final set, and the once crowded jazz club had thinned into soft conversation and half-empty glasses. But he remained planted, listening to the last note fade into the velvet hush of closing time. Juliet was gone. She didn't owe him anything, he knew that. But something in the way she'd looked at him before walking out had carved itself into his chest. Not fear, not rejection, conflict, he knew that look. He'd seen it in board meetings, in clients on the edge of major deals the moment before a leap, when everything inside pulled in two directions. And he had no idea which way she would fall. Outside, the air had cooled. A faint mist clung to the sidewalks as he stepped into the back of the waiting car. He didn't say anything to the driver, just stared out the window at the city blurring past. He should have played it slower. Should have let her come to him, but he wasn't wired for patience. Not when he wanted something this badly, and he wanted her. The next morning, Juliet sat at her sister's kitchen table, tracing circles in the condensation of a glass of orange juice. Leela was at the counter, frying eggs and sneaking glances. You're thinking too loudly, Leela said, flipping a spatula. Juliet looked up. Everything about him is too fast. Fast doesn't mean wrong, Juliet exhaled. But what if it is? What if I let myself get pulled in and then it all changes? He barely knows me. Leela plated the eggs and sat across from her. You're not scared of him. You're scared of what it means to want something you don't control. Juliet didn't respond. Do you want to see him again? Leela asked. Juliet hesitated. Yes. But I don't want to be a story he forgets by next week. Then don't be, Leela said. Make it real. Juliet stood, grabbed her sketchpad off the counter and left without finishing breakfast. She didn't call ahead. She didn't even know if he'd be there. But somehow, she found herself standing in front of a tall glass building in the heart of downtown, the kind of place with mirrored windows and a lobby that smelled like imported marble. Her stomach twisted as she walked toward the front desk. I'm here to see Julian Tate, she said. The receptionist looked up. Do you have an appointment? Juliet swallowed. No, but I think he'd want to see me. The receptionist hesitated, then nodded toward the elevator bay. Top floor. His assistant's name is Marcy. Juliet stepped into the elevator, heart slamming harder with each floor. When the doors opened, she was met with sleek interiors, dark wood, and glass walls that framed the skyline. A woman with polished nails and sharp eyes looked up from a desk. You must be Juliet, she said, standing. Juliet blinked. How did you? The way he described you made you hard to miss. Marcy smiled faintly. He's in a meeting, but I'll let him know you're here. Juliet sat on a velvet chair, clutching her sketchpad like armor. 10 minutes later, the office door opened. Julian stood in the doorway, eyes locked on hers. Cancel the rest of my morning, he said to Marcy. Never looking away, he walked toward her, not fast, not slow, intentional. I didn't expect to see you, he said, voice low. I wasn't sure I was coming, Juliet admitted. What changed? I stopped being afraid of what might happen, she said, and started thinking about what I'd regret if I didn't try. He studied her face. And what would you regret? Not seeing where this goes. He didn't touch her, didn't move, so she stepped closer. I like you, she said, but I don't know how to be someone who fits into your world. I don't want you to fit into it, Julian said. I want to build something new with you. That stopped her. She shook her head slightly. You say things like that so easily. Because it's simple, he said. I want you, not the version of you that makes sense on paper, just you. She looked down at the sketchpad in her hands. Slowly, she opened it and held it out to him. He took it, flipping through the pages. At first, they were city scenes, then people. Then he stopped, her latest sketch, him. On the plane, head tilted, eyes half lost in thought. Charcoal lines softening the sharpness of his jaw, capturing something intimate and unguarded. You drew this? I needed to remember how I saw you before I knew who you were. He closed the pad, holding it like it was fragile. You see things most people miss. I try to. Julian took her hand. Come with me. She didn't ask where, just followed down the elevator. Into the waiting car, they drove until the city gave way to open space. He didn't speak. Just watched her as the landscape changed, as the skyline melted into trees and the lake appeared in the distance. The car pulled up to a glass house perched on a bluff above the water. Clean lines, floor-to-ceiling windows, quiet. This is where I go when I need to think, Julian said, unlocking the door. No phone, no noise. Inside, the space was open and filled with art, modern pieces, sculptures, and a few canvases that looked untouched for years. Juliet walked slowly, taking it in. I bought this place but never really used it, he said. Felt too empty, she turned. Why bring me here? Because I don't want it to be empty anymore. She stood still. It's not a proposal, he added. It's a beginning. Juliet stepped to the window, the lake stretching wide below them. You really don't do anything halfway, do you? No, he said. Especially not with you. She turned back to him. I can't promise what happens next, she said, but I can stay. For now. He reached for her hand again, gently this time. That's all I need. And for the first time, neither of them felt like they were waiting for the other to speak. They just stood there, together, on the edge of something that didn't need to be defined yet because it had already begun. Juliet leaned her head against the cool glass of the lake house window, watching the horizon melt into a dusky lavender. The late afternoon sun was slipping behind the trees, casting long golden shadows across the hardwood floor behind her. Her sketchpad lay untouched on the nearby table, the pencil beside it still sharp from the morning. Julian stood in the open kitchen, sleeves rolled up, expertly slicing ripe tomatoes. The man who had once seemed untouchable now moved with unstudied ease, barefoot on the stone floor, as if he'd lived in this space for years. She watched him drizzle olive oil over a plate of burrata, a quiet focus in his movements. You're surprisingly competent with a knife, she said, stepping away from the window. He looked over his shoulder. I took a cooking class in Florence. It was either that or get scolded by a 75-year-old Italian woman for ruining her kitchen. Juliet leaned against the counter. And what made you think I'd be impressed by tomatoes and cheese? I wasn't trying to impress you, he said, arranging the dish with deliberate care. I wanted to feed you. There's a difference. She blinked, caught off guard. That's oddly specific. Julian picked up 2 plates and handed her one. If I've learned anything since meeting you, it's that you don't want grand, you want real. They ate on the back deck, overlooking the lake. The silence between them felt full rather than awkward, like a conversation without words. A breeze rolled across the water, lifting Juliet's hair slightly, and she tucked it behind her ear without thinking. Do you come here to get away from everything? She asked, setting her fork down. I used to, Julian said. But lately, I've been wondering if I built this place just to avoid feeling anything. She turned toward him. You're not avoiding anything now. No, he agreed. Now I'm inviting it in. Juliet folded her hands in her lap. I don't know what happens when I go back to Denver. Julian didn't flinch. Then don't. Her laugh was soft, almost sad. You can't just say that like it's simple. I'm not pretending it is, but I've got a guest house on the property. It's private, quiet, you could work from here. Draw, paint, whatever you need, she studied him. You're asking me to move here. I'm asking you to stay where you're seen, where you don't have to shrink to fit someone else's world. Juliet looked down at her hands. What if it's too much? I'd rather risk too much than lose something that felt this honest. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she stood and walked to the edge of the deck, arms crossed, staring at the still water. When I was little, she said finally, I used to draw maps of imaginary cities, whole worlds, places where nothing hurt and everything made sense. As I got older, they stopped being about escape. They started being about control. If I could draw it, I could fix it. Julian stepped behind her, not touching her, just listening. I can't draw this, she said quietly. I can't make it make sense. You don't have to, he said. You just have to choose it. She turned to face him. And what if I break it? Then we rebuild it, together. There was no hesitation in his voice, no fear, just certainty. Juliet's eyes filled, but she didn't look away. I don't want to leave, she said. Julian reached for her hand, linking their fingers. Then stay. The next morning, the guest house was already stocked with fresh linens and blank canvases. The small studio space had wide windows and a skylight that let the sun pour in. Juliet stood in the middle of it, barefoot, still in the oversized shirt she'd slept in. Julian watched her from the doorway. I had it built last year, never used it. She turned. You built a studio and never painted anything? I was waiting for the right person to fill it. Juliet walked to him, eyes searching his face. You're not afraid, are you? I've built empires from gut instinct, he said. This is the first time it's not about risk, it's about knowing. She leaned up and kissed him, slow and deep. A quiet promise passed between them. 3 weeks later, he flew her siblings in for a surprise dinner. No fanfare. Just a long table beneath string lights in the garden, handmade pasta, and wine that tasted like summer. Her youngest brother played songs on an old guitar while Leela leaned back in a hammock, laughing at a story Julian told about mistaking chili powder for cinnamon on his first cooking attempt. Juliet sat beside him, hand resting on his knee beneath the table. She didn't need to say anything. Everything she felt was already in the way she looked at him. That night, after everyone had gone to bed and the fire pit had burned to embers, she stood on the deck with Julian. The moonlight caught the edge of his jaw and he reached into his pocket. I wasn't going to do this yet, he said, pulling out a small velvet box, but I realized I don't want to wait for a moment that feels perfect when every moment with you already does. Juliet's breath caught, but he didn't open the box. This isn't a proposal, he said. She laughed, surprised. It's not. It's a key, he said, flipping the lid to reveal a delicate antique key on a chain. To the main house, to this life, to everything that's mine. You don't have to wear it. You don't even have to accept it. But I want you to know this isn't temporary. Juliet took the key, her fingers trembling slightly. You're giving me everything? No, Julian said, brushing her hair back. I'm giving us everything. She closed the space between them, resting her forehead against his. I never believed in fate, she whispered. Neither did I, he said. Until an overbooked flight forced me to sit in the last row. She laughed, tears sliding freely down her cheeks now, and kissed him again, the lake quiet behind them, the stars blinking approval overhead. And just like that, the girl who had needed a window seat to survive a flight, and the man who'd never once flown without luxury, found something neither had expected. A beginning that felt like coming home. Juliet paced the edge of the studio barefoot, her eyes flicking between the half-finished canvas and the late afternoon light spilling onto the floor. She hadn't touched a brush in days. Not out of fear or doubt those had faded, but because she'd been living so fully that capturing anything on paper suddenly felt small. The world around her had shifted, and with it, her sense of what needed to be expressed. Julian appeared at the door, leaning casually against the frame. His hair was tousled from the wind, and he held a pair of steaming mugs. "Chamomile," he said, stepping inside. "You look like you've been thinking in circles again." She took one of the mugs and sat on the window seat. "I'm trying to decide if I'm ready for the gallery." He set his mug down beside her. "What does ready look like for you?" "Not being terrified I'll be laughed out of the room," she said, staring at the canvas. "Leela's friend offered me a spot in her next show, Chicago, Real Collectors." "Real critics." Julian didn't offer reassurance. Instead, he reached for the edge of the canvas, turning it slightly into the light. "This one's different from the others." "It's the only one I painted here," she said. "The others were about trying to prove I existed. This one's just about being." He glanced at her, something tender flickering in his eyes. "Then it's already enough." Juliet sipped the tea, the warmth grounding her. "If I say yes to the show, it means stepping into a world I've only ever watched from the edges." "Then step," he said. "I'll be in the front row." She turned toward him. "You don't think it's too soon?" Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded pamphlet. He handed it to her. Inside was a layout design for a new arts foundation. Her name was at the top in elegant serif font, the Xander Initiative. She stared at the page, stunned. "What is this?" "A space for emerging artists," he said quietly. "Workshops, studio grants, funded residencies. I've been working on it with a few partners. You'd run it. You did this without telling me. I didn't want to influence you. I just wanted to show you that I believe in what you create, and I wanted you to have a choice, not a gift. A platform." Juliet looked at him, her voice soft. "You're serious? I've never been more." She set the pamphlet down and reached for his hand. "I want the gallery and the foundation. I want all of it, but not without you." "You never have to choose between us," he said. "We're not two different lives. We're one." A week later, they flew to Chicago, not on a private jet. Juliet asked for commercial. She wanted to remember what it felt like to fly with her feet still on the ground. Julian didn't argue. He just booked the entire first-class cabin and didn't mention it. The gallery opening was held in a converted loft, brick walls and high ceilings, filled with white space and soft lighting. Her paintings hung on the far wall, framed in minimalist black. People wandered in and out, sipping wine and studying each piece with quiet reverence. Juliet wore a navy satin dress that moved like water when she walked. Julian stayed by her side, his hand lightly at her back, never leading, just present. A woman in a sleek jumpsuit approached. "You're Xander," Juliet nodded. "I'm Harper Lynn. I run the New York Contemporary Collective." "You have a perspective that feels unfiltered, raw. We'd love to feature you in our spring exhibition." Juliet blinked. "Seriously, we'll be in touch," Harper said, offering a card and disappearing into the crowd. Juliet turned to Julian, wide-eyed. He raised an eyebrow. "Still feel like you're faking it?" She shook her head slowly. "No, not anymore." Later that night, back in the hotel suite overlooking the city's skyline, Juliet stepped out onto the balcony, the cool breeze brushing her skin. Julian joined her, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't taken that last seat?" she asked. "I try not to," he said, pressing a kiss to her shoulder, "because I can't imagine a life without this." She leaned back into him, her voice quiet. "I'm scared." "Of what?" "Of being too happy." Julian turned her gently to face him. "You're allowed to be happy, Juliet. You don't have to brace for the fall. This isn't a dream. It's a life, our life." She nodded, tears stinging her eyes. "I know." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. This time he didn't hesitate. "I said once that I wasn't proposing, but now I am." Juliet froze as he dropped to one knee, the city lights casting a silver halo around them. "I've built companies, made millions. But the only thing I've ever truly wanted to build is something with you. Will you marry me?" Tears spilled freely now, and she managed to whisper, "Yes. God, yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, a delicate band with a sapphire flanked by 2 diamonds, and stood to kiss her, slow and deep. 1 month later, they married beneath the trees at the lake house, surrounded by her family and his closest inner circle. There were no reporters, no headlines, just laughter, music, and the sound of water lapping gently nearby. Juliet walked down the aisle barefoot, carrying wildflowers. Julian wore a blue suit and didn't stop smiling once. Leela officiated, reading a poem Juliet had written years ago and never shared with anyone. After the ceremony, they danced under the stars, not choreographed, just instinct and music and joy. The foundation launched that fall. Juliet's gallery show traveled to New York, then San Francisco. She split her time between painting, mentoring young artists, and walking the woods with Julian in the early mornings. He built her a second studio by the lake, this one tucked beneath the trees with a skylight that opened to the stars. They spent nights there sometimes, curled on the floor with sketch pads and wine, dreaming out loud. When winter came, they spent a week in Florence. Not in a hotel. In a small apartment above a bakery, where the scent of fresh bread woke them each morning. Julian cooked again, still terrible at pancakes, still trying. They didn't chase perfection. They chased peace. And they found it in laughter, in quiet, in the way their hands always found each other in sleep. Juliet never needed a window seat again. Not because the fear disappeared, but because she'd built something stronger than fear. She'd found love. And it had found her right back.